welcome back. You are watching and listening to Breakfast with Stephen and Ellie.
Good morning to you. Let's look at the newspapers. Should we start with the Times? It leads on Ukraine's year of blood as the Prime Minister urges NATO members to supply Ukraine with former Soviet jet fighters.
The Mail also draws attention to the anniversary of the Ukrainian conflict, as well as the Queen Consort's swipe at the recent Roald Dahl censorship.
In the Eye, we're told ministers are planning to relax their hardline positions towards striking NHS workers.
The Sun dedicates their front page to the late football commentator John Motson, who died yesterday at the age of 77.
And the Star says, let them eat turnips, as Therese Coffey is criticised for her comments regarding Britain's salad shortage.
Well, time to go through the papers now, and joining us this morning is broadcaster Liz Kershaw and senior reporter at the Eye newspaper, Benjamin Butterworth. Good morning to you both.
Morning.
Lovely to see you this morning. And Liz, let's start with you, shall we? This is in the Daily Telegraph. The Archbishop of Canterbury's warning that Russia must not be treated like Germany. Tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, well, I always think a bit of history puts things into context. So, at the end of the First World War, we got the Treaty of Versailles, where the generals from each side and statesmen met up in a railway carriage in a forest. And basically, Germany was absolutely humiliated, crushed, economically, politically, in every sense. And that caused problems and actually directly led, in fact, to the Second World War, because in 1933, Adolf Hitler led the Nationalist Party, the Nazi Party, to victory by promising the German people pride, prosperity again. And of course, they were gagging for that. And then he, became aggressive in invading other countries, and we got involved when they invaded Poland. And it was a disaster, really. And looking back, people said we must never, ever behave towards a defeated party in a war like that again. In fact, after the Second World War, the reparation package of the help that Germany was given was so great. People like my granddad, who'd fought against the Germans in the Second World War, said, I don't know why we bothered. They're doing a lot better than we are now. So that's what he's referring to. But I think he's been a bit premature.
I think
it's hardly, we're hardly at that point in time in history, are we, where we say, right, that's all done and dusted. Now let's see how we treat the Russians going forward. It really is premature. And, it's been very virtuous and signalling it, but is it relevant on the first anniversary of the war, where we're talking up ramping up armaments?
I suppose there is the sense, isn't there, Benjamin, in all of this? I mean, right from the very beginning, it was made clear. I mean, Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, was speaking in Russian, wasn't he? Saying, we are not against the Russian people. So perhaps he's just reinforcing that point here on that we are not anti-Russian. We're just in effect, anti-Putin.
Yeah, and I have quite a number of Russian friends in this country whose family live back in Russia, and they're mortified by what's going on. They're actively speaking against it, which they can by living in this country, and their families are being damaged terribly by the consequences of Putin's actions. And actually, in the Daily Mail today, they've got polling from Russians, from Ukrainians, from Brits, from Americans, and what's interesting is that only 57% of people in Russia think that their special military operation, as they call it, as Putin calls it, is going well, which is quite incredible because you think about the propaganda machine that Putin has, the idea that barely half of them actually think it's a success. I think that shows that the average Russian is able to pick up on the kind of muddle that is going on right now. It's getting through to the reality. I mean, while if you go to Ukraine, it's 70 or 80% of them who think that they're doing a good defence of their country.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, that's in the Mail, isn't it? This poll saying there is soaring hope among 69% of Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Now, I just think that's really interesting because their whole attitude, the national attitude, has been, frankly, extraordinary. I mean, unusual.
It has.
I mean, it's worked to their advantage.
I mean, they are doing exceptionally well. You know, it may be a long way from victory because it's a war of attrition, but, you know, friends of mine that have been in Ukraine, and a couple of them who are there at the moment, they talk of how everybody on every street is doing what they can, is going up to journalists and helping them in any way to get the story out. They understand that they need the world's support. And actually, one of the things in this poll of the Daily Mail is that half of Britons and half of Americans support having jets, supporting that air capability that Zelensky's been asking for, which is, you know, it's just over half. And, you know, that's interesting because I think in any other modern conflict since the Iraq War, you wouldn't have found that kind of public support in countries like ours for spending that money.
What do you think it is then about the Ukraine conflict where there is so much support? I mean, as you were pointing to earlier, Stephen, I mean, it wasn't the same for Iraq and Afghanistan, but we are seeing that British support for Ukraine. Do you think it's because it's on our doorstep? It is right on the corner of Europe.
Also, we've not got boots on the ground.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
I think if you ask people, would you be OK for your son to be sent over there as a squaddie, fighting, you know, face to face, the answer would, I'm a mother, definitely not. So it's easy to say, oh, yeah, send these F-111s or whatever they're called, and our top pilots, but if necessary. But, yeah, ideally, that would be great. But I think that what it shows about the polls in Ukraine is what difference an inspirational leader can have. And Zelensky certainly, you know, from doing the comedy circuit, transformed himself and come into his own, and he really inspires people at home, domestically and internationally. And something we might be lacking here. You were saying earlier on, you know, we've got a lot. We think we're in a bad way. Look at what's happening over there. I think we do have a down on our own country because we haven't got that kind of inspirational, motivational leadership.
He even surprised them. I was filming with some refugees this week and I asked one of them about Zelensky and I said, what do you make of him? She burst into tears.
Yeah, I saw that.
Like, this time last year, he was like a laughing stock, really.
Yeah.
You know, he's a comedian, he's an actor, wasn't taken very seriously, and he just stood up to the plate, said he completely transformed his personality, and they're so grateful that it's him. I mean,
yeah, I mean, he clearly is an exceptional leader, and one of the things that Putin's Russia had been excellent at to some extent, or good at trying, was this propaganda. It was using social media to try and spin all sorts of conflicts. It was using news outlets that they would fund around the world. And actually, Zelensky has completely outdone Putin at that game. You know, his ability to capture the imagination of people around the world, to make them understand the reality, is quite remarkable. And what's interesting is that it's our admiration for Zelensky is mutual. It goes two ways, because 89% of Ukrainians say they admire Boris Johnson, 88% admire US President Joe Biden. And so clearly, you know, I think a lot of us feel that, you know, they're very grateful for the help we're doing, that we're on side and that we're on the victory side.
I think we must remember in the context, though, that this Russian-Ukrainian problem is not new. No. And we were talking last week about the similarities between this conflict and the Crimean War in the late 1850s, where nearly 500,000 people died, and for what? And then when I was at primary school in the 60s in Rochdale, Catholic primary school, half the kids in the class had Ukrainian parents because they'd left during the Second World War. So it's an ongoing issue. It's kind of a domestic issue between those neighbours, and I don't know. I don't think this is going to resolve it once and for all, because Russia has got this determination and core belief that Ukraine is part of the Russian Empire.
Yeah. But I think
it was at one stage.
Yeah,
I think.
Well, wasn't Kyiv the capital at one stage?
I think that was the original centre of their empire. But I think Putin will be gone before Ukraine's sovereignty. I think that's. I would confidently predict that. You know,
naturally or otherwise.
Well, I tell you what.
But there's a lot of people falling from high buildings in Russia that have been involved in their side of the war.
I've said from day one, I think that's the only way this is going to stop, actually.
Or take him out.
Is someone taken out, but it would have to be a very brave person to do it, because it would be a suicide mission.
Well, it'd be like Hitler and the plots to try and bump him off.
There will be something going on, because he doesn't, despite all the claims, he doesn't look ill. in all the latest footage.
No.
He looks all right.
He's a very fit man, isn't he? And he exercises a lot, and he's always on a horseback and things.
Well, he hasn't been seen bare-chested on a horse
In a while.
No, not for a while.
Oh, well, there you go.
What's going on with the Queen and having a swipe at this Roald Dahl censored? I've missed this. Why has Roald Dahl been censored?
Well, Roald Dahl books full of nasty, sticky, ghastly, gooey, cruel characters.
The fun of it.
Yeah, and kids like that because it appeals to the kids' fascination with everything yucky and dangerous, but in a safe way in a book. And there's always a moral to it, and usually the good
That's
is
why Horrible Histories has done so well.
Yeah. But the publishers have decided to sanitise it for the modern age, and so you can't refer to somebody as fat or ugly anymore, even if they are all warty and bent and haggard and all the rest of it. So it's censorship, and it's very 1984, because in 1984, George Orwell's novel and then film, books were all changed, history was changed, everything was changed. People didn't know about the past, and it really was scary stuff, and it seems to be coming. I mean, there are other books that have not, authors who've not been able to find publishers because nobody will touch them, because their view in non-fiction books, doesn't go with the woke agenda. And Camilla's waded in now and said, to an assembly of publishers, let's stop this. You are powerful people. Be a force for good. Stop doing it.
Right.
I mean, in other European countries, they've refused to accept this new version of the book. So clearly the pressure might lead to that. I mean, to be honest, for example, one of them is that they've taken the word fat out and they've used the word enormous. Now, I don't know about you, but
Enormous sounds worse.
Yeah, exactly. If someone were calling me enormous, I think I might be more annoyed.
Than
Yeah,
fat.
exactly.
Yeah.
But also, it seems like the kind of changes. There are things in old kids' books that actually we wouldn't change now. So if Mice and Men has, some racist terminology in there that maybe is so extreme that it would make sense to take out of a book that an 11-year-old is reading. But I don't think
that's the whole point of the book, isn't it? It's the whole racist element which is then challenged.
But you might change certain words because they are so extreme by modern ears. But I think in this, changing fat for enormous, or there's one point where there's a black cloak, and so the cloak is no longer black. Well, that is simply the colour of the material.
Ridiculous.
It's got no other connotation. And so I think they've kind of made a rod for their own back here, because it doesn't make a great deal of sense.
Kids don't read books and automatically emulate or mimic the characters that they read about. I remember Enid Blyton's, gone out of favour. I remember I read all the Secret Seven and all the famous 5 books. I lived in a terraced house in Rochdale, and these were like really, really spoilt, privileged, upper-class kids going around the countryside, banging on farm doors and demanding food from poor people. It just...
And now they're in the cabinet.
Yeah.
No, in the cabinet. Look, I just want to have a quick look. We're a little bit tight for time, Benjamin. I want to have a look at bad news for bachelor boys in the Times.
Oh, yes. So I'm going to die early. That's the news.
Are you?
Yep. Because apparently single men, not necessarily single women, but single men are more than 2 times likely to die of heart problems.
Why?
Because if you have a partner or a wife, then they're more likely to notice the kind of health issues that will cause it. And men are particularly bad at having those things going unnoticed. So you're I'm 2.2 times more likely to drop dead because I'm single. So, if anyone wants to marry me, it'll save my life, apparently.
Yeah, I think you need somebody, to be honest. There was another survey this week that if you are lonely or you live in a dirty house and there are other factors,
God, I've got no hope.
then you're going to die early. So if you're 70 and you're married and loved up and looked after, you can expect to live another 15 years. If you're not, you've got about another 4 years and you've had it.
Oh, dear.
Will somebody please take Benjamin under their wing?
I think it needs to be. Look, we'll see you two a little bit later on. Benjamin Butterworth, Liz Kershaw, thank you very much indeed.